The wedding hall was silent. Not the kind of silence that comes from peace, but the heavy, uneasy quiet of people holding back whispers. The bride stood alone at the altar, her hands trembling slightly, her veil trembling with the faint draft. She was older than the other brides they had seen in this town, her hair streaked with silver, her eyes lined not with makeup but with memories. Everyone had come expecting a miracle, a man to step forward and claim her hand, but the minutes dragged, and no one moved. The guests began exchanging awkward glances. The priest shifted uncomfortably. "Is there anyone here who claims this bride?" he repeated. No voice answered. The woman's lips quivered, and in that moment, she looked less like a bride and more like a ghost of hope itself. Her name was Clara. Once, she had been beautiful in a way that made people stop in the street. But time had stolen that beauty piece by piece, replacing it with the quiet dignity of someone who had endured too much. She had been engaged once, years ago, to a man who vanished the day before their wedding. Some said he ran away with another woman, others said he died. Clara never told anyone which story she believed. Instead, she carried on, living in a small house on the edge of town, working, aging, and waiting, though she could never explain what for. When the local community arranged a charity event for people who had no families, no partners, no one to claim them, someone suggested she take part in a symbolic wedding. A chance to be seen, to feel loved, even if only in gesture. She hesitated, but finally agreed, saying softly, "Maybe it will close an old chapter." But no one expected this. The hall had been decorated with flowers and candles, her white dress a little too large, borrowed from someone's attic. The music had played softly when she entered. Everyone had smiled, until it became clear there was no groom. She waited for someone to step forward, anyone, even as her eyes darted through the crowd. Old neighbors looked down. Young couples held hands and avoided her gaze. It was cruel in a way that had no words, an old woman dressed as a bride, standing before the altar, unwanted and unseen. The priest's question hung in the air again, "Does anyone claim this bride?" Clara forced a faint smile, whispering, "It's all right, Father. I suppose," but before she could finish, a small voice broke the silence. "That's her, that's my mama." Every head turned. In the last row, a little girl stood clutching a worn teddy bear, her dress wrinkled, her eyes wide with something both innocent and certain. She couldn't have been more than 6 years old. She pointed directly at Clara, her tiny hand shaking but unwavering. "That's my mama," she said again, louder this time, her voice echoing through the hall. Gasps rippled across the room. People began murmuring, looking from the girl to the old bride. Clara blinked, utterly frozen. "Sweetheart," she whispered, her voice trembling, "I think you're mistaken," but the child shook her head stubbornly. "No, I'm not. You're her. You're the lady from the picture." The crowd parted as a young social worker hurried forward, her face pale. "I'm so sorry," she whispered to Clara, "I don't know how she got in. She's from the shelter downtown." Clara knelt slowly, her dress pooling around her feet like a cloud. "What picture, dear?" she asked gently. The little girl dug into her small backpack and pulled out a crumpled photograph. It was faded and torn, but when Clara looked at it, her heart stopped. It was a photo of her, years younger, holding a baby. Her breath caught. The air in the hall seemed to vanish. "Where did you get this?" she whispered. The girl blinked up at her. "They told me she's gone," she said softly, "but I prayed I'd find her someday. And when I saw you, I knew." The guests had gone utterly still. The social worker stammered, "Her name's Lily. She was left at the shelter 2 years ago with only that photo. We've been trying to trace her mother ever since, but the trail went cold." Clara's trembling fingers brushed the photograph again. It was real, hers. She remembered that day, the baby in her arms, the storm, the desperate choice she'd made. She had been young, terrified, and alone, forced to give up her child to keep her safe. She had lived every day since with the guilt of it. Now that child was standing before her, calling her mama. Tears filled her eyes. She didn't care about the guests anymore, or the whispers, or the empty ceremony. She opened her arms, and the little girl ran straight into them, sobbing into her shoulder. The priest lowered his gaze, and even the coldest onlookers turned away to hide their tears. "I'm so sorry," Clara whispered into Lily's hair. "I never stopped looking for you." The girl clung tighter. "I told them you were real," she said, her voice muffled. "I told them you'd find me." The room, once filled with pity, now shimmered with something else, something like grace. The music that had stopped began again, softly, as if the hall itself had understood what had just happened. The priest cleared his throat gently. "Perhaps," he said quietly, "this wedding was meant for something greater than we thought." Clara stood, holding Lily's hand, her veil slipping back to reveal her tear-streaked smile. The candles flickered brighter, and for the first time in years, she looked alive. The ceremony was never finished in the way it was planned. But when Clara walked out of that hall with her daughter beside her, no one doubted what they had witnessed, a union, not of husband and wife, but of a mother and child lost to time. Outside, the rain had stopped, and the sun broke through the clouds as if blessing them both. When Clara stepped out of the hall with Lily's tiny hand in hers, it felt like walking through a dream she had long forgotten how to believe in. The wind brushed her face softly, carrying the smell of rain and wet earth. People gathered by the doorway, whispering as they watched them go, but Clara didn't care anymore. Her heart was pounding, not with fear, but with a strange, aching joy. The child's hand was warm, her grip so sure, as if she had known Clara all her life. For a long moment, they simply stood there in silence. Then Lily looked up and said in her small voice, "Can we go home now?" The word, home, shattered something deep inside Clara. Home, something she hadn't truly felt in years. "Yes," she whispered, kneeling down to meet her daughter's eyes. "We'll go home, sweetheart. I promise." The social worker followed, her face still pale from shock. "Miss Clara, I don't know what to say. This is unbelievable. We'll need to check records, confirm everything, but that photograph," Clara smiled faintly. "I'll tell you the whole story," she said. "Every painful bit of it." And so she did. As they sat together in Clara's small kitchen later that evening, while Lily colored quietly at the table, the truth finally came out, truth that had been buried for nearly 7 years. Clara told her about her youth, about the man she had loved so deeply, a man named Michael who had promised her the world but vanished before their wedding. She had discovered she was pregnant soon after, and with no family left to help, she had struggled alone. When Lily was born, Clara said softly, "I thought love would be enough." But it wasn't. Her eyes clouded with old pain. The landlord had evicted her. She'd lost her job. The bills piled up like walls closing in. There was one night, she continued, her voice trembling, a storm worse than any I've ever seen. I was desperate. Lily had a fever. I couldn't feed her. I walked to the church, hoping someone would take her in for a while, until I could stand on my feet again. She looked down at her hands. I left her there, just for the night, I thought. Just one night, but when she returned, the shelter had moved her baby to another town, and no one knew where. For years, Clara wrote letters, begged, searched, until the officials finally told her to stop. They said there was no trace. She had to accept that her child was gone. But she never did. She kept that same old photograph by her bedside, the one that Lily had somehow carried with her. The social worker listened, tears glistening in her eyes. So she was never abandoned, she whispered. She was loved, always loved. As the story spread through the town, people began to see Clara differently. The same faces that had once looked away from her at the altar now visited her small house with gifts, apologies, and tears. The local newspaper ran her story, a wedding that reunited a mother and daughter. But what mattered most to Clara was not the sympathy or attention, it was the quiet mornings when Lily would wake up and climb into her bed, wrapping her tiny arms around her. Those were the moments that healed the years of emptiness. "You smell like flowers," Lily once said, pressing her face into Clara's hair. Clara smiled. "That's because you're here," she whispered back. One afternoon, while sorting through old boxes, Clara found a faded letter hidden in the folds of her wedding veil. It was from Michael, the man who had left her. Her hands shook as she read it. He hadn't run away. He had been drafted for war, and the letter had never reached her. In his final words, he wrote, "If I cannot come back, promise me you'll find joy again. And if we ever have a daughter, tell her I loved her before she was even born." Clara pressed the letter to her heart, tears falling silently. "He never left me," she murmured. Later, she showed it to Lily, who listened wide-eyed and said, "So Daddy loved me too." Clara nodded through her tears. "Yes, my darling, he did." In the months that followed, Clara began volunteering at the same shelter that had once cared for her daughter. She became a mother not just to Lily but to many lost children who had no one to call their own. People said her house had changed. It was always full of laughter now, full of light. Every corner smelled of freshly baked bread, every wall had drawings and photos pinned up. Lily thrived, her laughter echoing in the same rooms that had once been filled with loneliness. And every evening, before bed, she would say, "Good night, Mama," in a way that made Clara's heart overflow with quiet gratitude. Sometimes, Clara would return to that hall where the wedding had taken place. It stood empty most of the year, but she would light a candle there, standing where she once stood alone. Only now, she never felt alone again. She often whispered, "Thank you," though she wasn't sure who she was thanking, God, fate, or that brave little girl who refused to stop believing. The hall had been a place of embarrassment once, but now it was sacred to her, the place where she had been given her miracle. Years later, on Lily's 10th birthday, the townsfolk gathered again in that same hall, this time not for a wedding, but for a celebration of family. Clara, now older, stood beside her daughter, who wore a small white dress of her own, and the priest who had once asked, "Does anyone claim this bride?" smiled warmly as he said, "Now we know the answer." The crowd laughed, and Lily looked up proudly. "That's my mama," she said again, just like that day years before. Only now, there was no confusion, no silence, only applause and tears of joy. Clara looked around the hall, her heart full, her eyes glistening with gratitude. She realized life had a strange way of returning what it once took, only in its own time, in its own way. That wedding, meant to symbolize loneliness, had become the beginning of everything. And as Lily danced among the guests, her laughter lighting up the room, Clara whispered to herself, "Sometimes, the greatest love stories are not between two lovers, but between a mother and the child she thought she lost forever."